So if they chose to do that, then they had these stipulations. Stipulations included the slaves had to have a day off. They had to be treated as if they're a fellow Jew or an Israelite, whatever you want to call them. They had to be loved like it. They had to join your feasts. They had to do all this fun stuff. They were actually given a compensation so they could go out and they could spend their wage on whatever.
No, that does not represent biblical slavery whatsoever. I mean, I cannot honestly believe that an apologist doesn't understand how biblical slavery was chattel slavery. So everything that he just said is utterly ridiculous and not found in the evidence. You literally have to twist the information and lie about what's in the book. God, if you heathens want to fuck around and find out how bad two Christian TikTok apologists are about biblical slavery, then please stay tuned. What's up, heathens? How ya doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. One of the topics that I hate dealing with the most from apologists is biblical slavery, because they 100% always get it wrong, whether that be on moral foundations or on just what the Bible says in general. Today's two TikTok Christian apologists are no different. They are gonna get it completely wrong. They're gonna get it completely wrong on like moral grounds, as well as what's literally in the Bible. All right, let's find out what these two apologists have to say. First up is an apologist from the Workers for Christ TikTok account. He has a uniquely dumb position on biblical slavery.
Now, Jeff, I would really encourage you, if you're going to respond to this in a way that actually engages the argument and answers the question that I'm going to ask.
Oh, okay. So Jeff is a atheist creator on TikTok, and he's notoriously banned by TikTok multiple times. That's why his name on TikTok right now is TikTok Please Don't Ban Me. Jeff is a pretty good friend, so I'm sure that he responded appropriately to this guy. But let's actually address the problem or the question that he's going to be presenting here. I'm sure that he's in no way going to misrepresent what's in the Bible or biblical slavery or any of that kind of shit. He's going to be totally straight and honest with us, right?
So your entire argument starts off with this presupposition, but the problem is it's a very bad presupposition because it doesn't really work 100% of the time. The presupposition is that because something is in God's law, he must be in support of it. You say this about slavery, and this is why you claim that the God of the Bible supports slavery.
Well, so it's not a presupposition. I mean, that's just how shit works. While on a human level, us making up laws to control certain things in societies, and maybe those laws don't really reflect what we want, I feel like that's a very human level thing. But what we're talking about is God and God's law. And you really don't have a good argument here if this is the route that you're going to go with, because God painstakingly tells the Israelite people exactly how he wants shit. He tells the Israelite people exactly how encrusted to make the Ark of the Covenant. He lays out very specific building plans for the temples, like both of them that he has them built. When God told Moses to build the Ark, he gave very specific plans. So specific, at least, that, you know, we could conceivably build the Ark today, which is something that Ken Ham over at the Ark Encounter museum attraction. I don't know what to fucking call it, but it's a boat that don't float. Anyways, he supposedly reconstructed the Ark out of what's in the Bible. So don't tell me that God can't just sit down and say, hey, don't own people, or, you know, just put in some very basic fucking things. By God allowing something to happen, he essentially condones it. But he does more than condone it. He actually commands the taking of sexual slaves, like in Numbers 31, where he has the Israelite people attack the Midianite people and destroy them. Oh, with the exception of all the little prepubescent girls that have not known the touch of a man. Have you allowed all the women to live? he asks them. They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and enticed the Israelites to be unfaithful to the Lord in the Peor incident, so that a plague struck the Lord's people. Now kill all the boys and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man. Numbers 31:15-18. Now, a lot of apologists like to suggest that the Midianites were just asking for it. This was a wartime effort. Like, they were seeking vengeance because of something the Midianites did to the Israelites. Number one, that doesn't excuse them stealing all the prepubescent girls so that they could take them as sexual slaves. And I get it, you don't like thinking about it like that, but that's essentially what this is. Destroying an entire city and taking little girls as sexual plunder. Two, you really can't argue that the Midianites were asking for it, because the only thing that the Midianites did were mingle with the Israelites. This entire thing is about mixing the races. 1950 segregation shit. God doesn't like that, and so he had the Israelites go and destroy this entire race of people, with the exception, of course, for the little girls. This is a clear-cut example of sexual slavery and God directly commanding the Israelites to come in and take sexual slaves. Put this into the context of whatever in the fuck this guy's trying to tell us. Whatever he's trying to spin our direction. He's trying to suggest that just because God has certain laws and things in his Bible, that doesn't mean that he condones this behavior. Well, my question is, and maybe you can honestly interact with this there, dipshit, do you really think that if God didn't condone taking of slaves or capturing little girls as sexual slaves, do you really think that if he didn't condone that, he would command it? Forget about the laws that definitely prove that God condones the taking of slaves and the purchasing of slaves. But this part right here, where you simply cannot separate the fact that God commands the taking of slaves with him condoning slavery. You can't divorce the two ideas.
And even why the Bible itself tells us slavery is okay. The problem with this is, one, you can't demonstrate that this is God's ideal moral law of the land, and every piece of evidence that the Bible gives us about the law indicates that it's not.
Oh, where exactly? I would really love a fucking citation for this, like how we know that this isn't his ideal situation. Well, let me ask this. If God can ideally dictate to his prophets and whoever else exactly what kind of fire to use to light incense, how encrusted the little dildos on his ark are, and exactly how golden his throne room should be in the temple, then why can't his ideal moral law just exclude slavery? I'm not trying to suggest that I know God's mind or know what God's ideal set of morality is. But considering all of the little nitpicky things that God lays out for the Israelites, along with the fact that he's supposed to be the standard for everything, he's all powerful, he's all knowing. These people are supposed to follow whatever he says, no matter what. And the consequences are dire. Like I mentioned before with the whole fire being used to light the incense. Well, two priests early on, I do believe it was Moses' brothers, sons, two of them used the wrong kind of fire to light the incense. That's it. You know what God did? He Hadouken two fireballs right up their ass and caused them to explode spontaneously. You're trying to tell me that God, in his moral foundation that he lays out in his covenant with the Israelites, he couldn't just say, hey, don't own other people. That's really shitty. Why would God lay down any kind of law that wasn't his ideal kind of law? Also, another good question is, why is it that God has to work around whatever the Israelites would accept? This seems to be kind of like circular, because it's like the Israelites must listen and do whatever God says, but God also has to craft laws that will make it easy for the Israelites to follow. Like, I don't know. This just seems to be like a dog chasing his tail here.
So my question to you, Jeff, is how do you conclude that the reason God allowed slavery is because he was okay with slavery.
Well, probably because he directly commands the Israelites to take slaves, and he also sets up the foundation for the Israelites to properly purchase slaves from the nations around them. Like here in Leviticus 25:44 through 46. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you, and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. But you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. So here's my question. Again, I feel like I'm kind of repeating myself, but the question must be asked. If God could sit there in the same breath and say, hey, don't take your Israelites as chattel slaves, then he could also say, hey, don't take anybody as chattel slaves. I don't see why it's so difficult for him to do that if he doesn't approve of it. It's obvious that God doesn't condone the taking of Israelite slaves, or, well, specifically the Israelites taking their fellow countrymen as slaves. So why is it different for the foreigners? Why is it different? Now, coming from a secular perspective on this, it makes a lot of sense because this matches with the other laws in the Near East at that time. In that area, these laws were pretty much a standard thing. Don't take your countrymen as a slave, but you can purchase slaves from the countries around you. Like, those were the laws that were pretty much standard throughout the Near Eastern cultures at that time. So from a secular perspective, it makes total sense. Where it does not make sense and is actually contradictory with reality and internally contradictory to your own theology is when you try to convince somebody or you try to make the argument that God doesn't condone slavery, but allows it for whatever kind of fucking reason. God is the one setting the rules here. God is in the power position. If he doesn't want people to take slaves, he can very obviously tell them, hey, don't take these people as slaves. But God distinctly chose to say, hey, take those people as slaves, but don't take these people as slaves. You really have no argument there to say, oh, God doesn't condone slavery when God specifically condones it.
Now, if you were an intellectually honest person, your argument wouldn't be so stretched out. You wouldn't stop at God is pro-slave. You would stop at God allowed slavery, and we really don't know why.
Let's see. Do we not know why? My guess is, and I'm just spitballing here, is that these laws that we're talking about here are representative of the laws that were commonly found throughout cultures in the Near East at the time. So, considering that they are pretty much the standard, it makes a lot of sense that they would have their God instruct them to keep with the standard that had already been laid out. It's not about like knowing God's mind or knowing what God's ideal moral law is. If God is in the power position, he can set the rules, and he does set the rules in the Bible. So why doesn't he set the rule that you just can't own another person? I feel like that's a legitimate question that needs to be answered by apologists, and you really don't have a good answer for it because you would have to lie about what's directly in the text in order to argue against it. And it amazes me at how quick apologists are at lying about these things. All right, one TikTok apologist down, another one to go. Let's see what our next guest has for us. So our next guest is from the Yolt Christian podcast. And he's a car theist, so I mean, he's driving while making this video, which is just the smartest fucking thing ever, but we'll just move right on past that. But he has a unique view on biblical slavery as well. It's not so much unique as just another way to spin it, but let's get on into his video and see what kind of bullshit he's going to spring our way.
Jared, the Bible condones slavery. Well, United States law condones murder. Wait, what?
Yeah, that's kind of a what situation right there, because United States law does not condone murder. But also, I would say that I don't think that United States law is directly representative of anybody's morality necessarily. This is just our best attempt at trying to dictate a society that's got the best chance for survival, for everybody to survive and thrive and be able to live together. Now, what is murder exactly? Murder is the unlawful killing of another person, normally premeditated, just a bare bones kind of murder charge, premeditated, unlawful killing. Now, that unlawful part is very important because that means that it's against the law to do it. So no, the U.S. legal code does not allow for murder. The nuance that exists here is that the U.S. law doesn't prevent somebody from killing another person for different reasons. But killing somebody in the legal sense is different than just murdering somebody. It's a distinct nuance, but I feel like it needs to be pointed out for this video.
Yeah, as long as, they break into your home or it's in self-defense, it condones murder.
That would be a lawful killing. So that doesn't mean that it's murder. If it's a lawful killing, not murder, because it's directly contradictory to what murder is. Dipshit.
So since the United States law condones murder, and obviously murder is bad, why don't you hold the United States law to the same standard that you're holding the Bible to?
Well, good question there, young apologist in a car. That's because the U.S. legal code or U.S. law is not God. The Bible is supposedly God. That is the major difference. I'm not going to hold the U.S. legal code or U.S. law to the status of God. God is supposed to be the standard for all morality. He is supposed to be the one that lays down his ideal moral code, if you will. And since that includes the taking of slaves, it seems like God condones slavery.
After all, you don't think the Bible's real, so what's it matter? It's because you're trying to prove a flaw that's not there.
I'm trying to prove a flaw in the morality of the Bible and this whole idea of whether or not God is somehow the standard for morality, or God, is all good all the time, omnibenevolent. That's the word I'm looking for. I mean, that's a clear example of how God is not omnibenevolent. So yeah, it definitely is there. We've already laid out a couple of passages that prove that it's there. So I don't understand why you're trying to twist this around into something that it's not. Other than maybe you can't actually argue against the actual position.
Look, obviously murder is bad and the law states so. It just lists conditions for in case it happens.
No, it doesn't. It lists conditions upon which killing another person is not murder and is lawful, but it does not indicate any kind of stipulations as to when murder is okay or is not illegal, because murder itself is unlawful.
The Bible does the exact same thing with slavery. It's really not that hard to understand. You're just trying to find flaw.
I mean, you really don't got to look too far in order to find any kind of flaws in the Bible. I mean, starting right from the beginning where God supposedly creates everything, there's a flaw. So right out the gate, the Bible's kind of fucked for being flawless. But as far as slavery goes, you really don't have to search or anything like that. In fact, if you want to go and get Dr. Joshua Bowen's book about slavery and Christianity, I highly suggest you go and do that and educate yourself. That goes for the guy in the video and for you heathens as well. Definitely get Dr. Josh's book. Okay, so that's the end of his first video. And now we've got a second video from him clarifying what he thinks about biblical slavery. And you're going to notice a classic argument that is usually used by apologists, and I'm surprised hasn't already come up.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There's a quick answer and a long answer, and so my quick answer is the murder thing, which sounds bad if you're watching this video and you don't watch the previous video. And then the long answer is, you're right, it's more like indentured servitude, it's debt slavery, so people...
No, let me make this very clear. There's a distinction between debt slavery and chattel slavery in the Bible. Those are two very different things. A good example of debt slavery or an indentured servant would be the story of Jacob and how he got his 2 wives. You see, Jacob didn't have enough money to buy a wife for himself, as property. And so what he did was he chose to sell his labor, basically, for 7 years to Rachel, his future wife's father. And so he worked for 7 years, but the problem is that the father played a little bit of a switcheroo with him and gave him Rachel's sister, which he then bedded that night and consummated the marriage before he could figure out that this wasn't Rachel. So he worked for another 7 years selling his labor to Rachel's father in order to buy Rachel, again, as property, from her father. That's an example of the indentured servitude that we're talking about here, at least one that appears in the Bible. Now, that doesn't mean that other forms of indentured servitude didn't exist. Like somebody was just too poor and didn't have a place to live, or, didn't have enough money to buy food to eat. They could sell themselves into indentured servitude and they would have a home, they would have food and all this other stuff. That definitely did happen. But as far as what's in the Bible and good examples of indentured servitude, the Jacob one highlights a lot of problems with this whole idea of slavery just being indentured servitude, or the idea that indentured servitude was only ever used in the case of not having enough money to have a house and have food. So another curious instance is that with these debt situations, fathers and specifically fathers, could sell their children into debt slavery. That's right. You could sell your child into debt slavery because you owed a debt to somebody. So, there's a lot of different things. It's all covered in Dr. Josh's book. I suggest that you read it. But that would be indentured servitude. Now there's chattel slavery, which chattel slavery is where the Israelites would buy slaves or capture slaves from surrounding people groups. In fact, that Leviticus 25:44-46 is specifically God telling the Israelites that is where they can buy their slaves from, and that they are not to get their slaves from the Israelite nation. So, trying to turn the slavery in all of its forms that occurs in the Bible into only ever indentured servitude is not accurate, and just shows that you're willing to lie about what the Bible says in order to push your apologetic agenda.
Willingly go into slavery. It's a different kind of slavery than what you and I think of. When we hear slavery, we think of Civil War type slavery in the West. But
well, yes. And do you know what book the lawmakers used in order to model their laws for slavery? The Bible. So the lawmakers who set out the Civil War slavery or the Southern slavery and all that, the laws that govern that are based on the Bible. It's really kind of hard to divorce the idea of chattel slavery from the Bible.
Slavery in Bible times was people would go into debt, and then they would go to the person that they're in debt to and be like, hey, I'll work it off, so that, they work off their debt. And so that's the slavery that they would do.
No. See, that's called indentured servitude or debt slavery. But that's not indicative of all slavery, but that's also not the only situation, like I pointed out before, where Jacob sold his services or became a debt slave or an indentured servant, and in order to buy women as property. So, there's that.
And then after 7 years, that was the max that they could be a slave for. So they would be freed after 7 years. If they went in with their wife and kids, then they'd leave with their wife and kids. But if they married a woman while they were in there, then and that woman had her own debts to pay, she'd have to stay to pay off her own debts.
This is not entirely accurate. A lot of it is accurate, but the woman that he's talking about here with the one debt slave marrying another slave, typically the loophole that exists there is that the master would give the debt slave a wife in the form of an actual slave, like a foreign slave. So a chattel slave. Now, this chattel slave would be, property of the masters forever. Chattel slaves were not released after 7 years. This is just simply a whitewashing of slavery in the Bible. If I had to pick out the purest example of whitewashing of slavery in the Bible, I would send people this video, because that's exactly what this is. So the loophole is that the debt slave who gets freed after 7 years, which, mind you, the debt slaves that got freed are only the men. The women most likely wouldn't get freed. But in this particular instance, the debt slave man who's being released has to choose between the family that he's made with the chattel slave or freedom. He can't take the chattel slave with him because the chattel slave is property of his masters. So he's got to make a tough decision. Either he becomes a slave forever, or he leaves his family that he's built in that 7 years. But personally, I feel like that's not really even a choice. I really wouldn't expect the guy to just leave his wife, be like, YOLO, I'm outie 5,000. I just don't expect that out of the guy. Although, they could do whatever they want. I guess it just would make him a big dick.
So I said a long answer because there's a lot of nuance to it. If your slave does this, the master does this. If the master does this, the slave does this, sort of thing. And so that's the nuance. But yeah, you're entirely right. The biblical slavery is indentured servitude. It's debt slavery.
No, that's not correct. As we've shown, there was definitely chattel slavery. There were definitely slaves that were properties of people. So, yeah.
Nothing like what the West thinks of it when we hear slavery. And then there's some more nuance, like they would adopt foreigners as their slaves occasionally, and in doing so, they had a lot of stipulations if they chose to do so, this goes along more of the murder laws, right? So if they chose to do that, then they had these stipulations. Stipulations included the slaves had to have a day off. They had to be treated as if they're a fellow Jew or an Israelite, whatever you want to call them. They had to be loved like it. They had to join your feasts. They had to do all this fun stuff. They were actually given a compensation so they could go out and they could spend their wage on whatever it was. So
I'm sorry. Did you just say that slaves were paid? They were property. They were not paid for their services. One of the primary aspects of being a slave is that you don't get paid. You are owned by another person. You don't get paid. There's definitely nothing in the Bible about paying slaves. I don't know where you're getting this. A citation would be awesome right now because I have no idea where in the fuck you're getting this from, unless it's just from an apologist that's pulled it out of their ass in order to make slavery in the Bible seem not so bad. The Israelite code for slaves, like chattel slaves, actual chattel slaves, was actually a little bit harsher than the surrounding areas. Like, for instance, you could beat a slave with a rod. The Israelites actively believed in the fact that, the only way to instruct a slave is to beat them. That whole spare the rod, spoil the child worked for slaves as well as children. Now, that doesn't mean that they were encouraged to just abuse slaves, but it also doesn't preclude them from abusing the slaves. You kind of have to take it with the nuance that exists there. While it doesn't say, hey, beat your slaves, it also says, hey, don't do that. That's a dick thing. Also, why do you own another person? But yeah, I've never heard of slaves being paid a wage so that they can go out and buy shit in places.
So essentially what it is like what they were doing for those foreigners is they give them, so like in college, there's an RA, a resident assistant. And so it's essentially what the college is doing is what they were doing to these foreign slaves, where they say, hey, we'll give you room and board, and in doing so, we'll give you wages for food and stuff like that. That's exactly what colleges do.
No, that is not what chattel slavery was like in the Bible. I don't know where in the fuck you're getting this, but RAs in college are not owned by the college. Yeah, they're given, I guess, money for, providing a service to the college. But, this is not at all compared to chattel slavery, because while the master did have to take care of the slaves, feed the slaves, shelter the slaves, and everything like that, you would do the exact same thing for other property, for other animals that they owned. And that's how they saw slaves, as animals, as property, as chattel, shit to be bought, traded, and bartered. So trying to argue your way around this and coming to this whole idea that it's a lot like being an RA for college, it's just laughable. And I don't know why you would go here with this. Oh my God. Anyways, that's going to be it for the 2 videos today. I don't know. This topic always gets me really heated. And it's primarily because you have to actively be lying about what's in the Bible in order to say this shit. Slaves were paid. Where in the fuck does that come from? Because I have no idea. Also, the whole idea about indentured servitude and debt slavery, everything that he said about that was completely fuckered. And I feel like you have to just either not know what is in the Bible at at all, or you have to be actively lying about what's in the Bible or what happened in Israelite society at this time. It's one of the two. You gotta pick one. And I feel like if you've got like a Christian ministry or you're trying to start up an apologetic channel, I would hope that you would at least know what's in your Bible. That's what leads me to think that these two guys in the video today are just lying about it because they have to know what's in the Bible. Anyways, if you will, please leave a comment down below what you thought about these two TikTok Christian apologists. Do you agree with them, or do you think that they're both kind of full of shit? Let me know down below. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.